Dear guests, students, and colleagues, thank you very much for your presence today. It's our distinct honor to welcome Professor Wael Hallaq once again for the third and final lecture in the thought-provoking series titled What is Sharia? In the inaugural lecture, The Ethical Structure, Professor Hallaq explored the intricate relationship between Sharia law and ethics, offering insightful comparisons to modern legal frameworks. The second lecture shed light on the profound value of humanity within Islamic law, critiquing contemporary views through a nuanced historical lens. In today's lecture, Professor Hallaq will unveil the main constitutional features of Islamic governance from a structural historical perspective. The main aim is to delineate the functions of legislative, judicial, and executive powers within Islamic governance and to examine their interrelationships. This discussion promises to enrich our understanding of Islamic legal and political theory, offering fresh insights into its enduring relevance and sophistication. Just before, I want to remind you, for those who need translation, they can pick up the mics from in front of the podium. Well, in our tradition, in Arabic tradition, Arabic grammarians used to say al-ma'rufu la yu'arraf, which equals don't define the definite or the well-known. However, for those for those joining us for the first time, our distinguished speaker, Professor Wael Hallaq, is the Avalon Foundation Professor in the Humanities at Columbia University, where he has been teaching ethics, law, and political thought since 2009. His teaching and research cover the intellectual history of Orientalism and the way it captures the problematics of modernity. His work also deals with the synchronic and diachronic development of Islamic traditions of logic, legal theory, and substantive law. And he has explored the structural dynamics of legal change in pre-modern law. For the past decade and half, his work has increasingly focused on the critique of modern project, including the paradigmatic structures of knowledge that drive it, as well as the relationship between governance and ethics. His current research attempts to map constitutional practices of Islamic governance between the 8th and 18th century, with a view, among other things, to constructing a heuristic for a critique of modern constitutional arrangements. Professor Hallaq's work over the last 4 decades has established him as a leader in the field. He has produced numerous books and dozens of peer-reviewed articles. It's widely debated in academia as well as social and mass media, and has been translated into over a dozen languages. He is a recipient of many prestigious awards, including honorary membership in research and science foundations. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Hallaq. Professor Hallaq, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The third of the lectures and last. I will miss you after this. So thank you for the kind introduction, Samuel. In the first 2 lectures, I spoke of the ethical and the human in the Sharia. We saw how one bears on the other and how the ethical permeates all aspects of the Shari'i world. I also intimated throughout that the substantial differences between the Islamic system and our modern counterparts have to do with the qualitative differences in the underlying ethical metaphysical and cosmological views. The modern subject, I suggested, has paradigmatically placed itself in a world produced by a cosmic accident rather than by a consciously deliberate creator. This difference, I suggest, is everything, because it bears significance for the entire range of human forms of knowledge which are behind all modes of conduct and acting in the world. Everywhere, whether it is in politics, government, and much else in the religious sphere. The qualitative differences between these systems also have a significant impact on everything political, on how we interpret secularist and nationalist politics today, but also on how we read political practice in Islamic history prior to modernity. By political practice, I do not mean only the actual acts of politics, as in how a ruler ruled on a daily basis. In the concept of political practice, I include political discourses as well as the structural modalities of thinking and writing about politics and the business of governing. All in all, we can call this the discursive tradition of politics in Islam. So my argument is that there was a recognizably coherent and discursively established tradition in Islam across the centuries, from roughly the 4th century of the Hijrah down to the late Ottomans. I would also argue that the formative period of the first 3 or 4 centuries and roughly the last 2 centuries were, for different reasons in each case, somewhat turbulent, in that they did not have the relative consistency and constancy of the middle centuries. That is, between the late 4th century and the 13th. That is, in the Gregorian calendar, between the late 10th century to the middle of the 19th. This does not mean that this middle history, the long middle history, was always the same, monolithic or repetitious. Not at all. In fact, it went through 3 general stages of development, as I show in a book that should see the light hopefully sooner than later. I got asked a couple of times already while coming here, just walking in, when is it going to appear? So I'm going to tell everybody, so I will spare you asking the question. Hopefully, I will be done with it within 6 months to 1 year at most, meaning until it is submitted to press. And this lecture is kind of the generalized inspiration from conclusions of that book. But these changes, as happened meaning the changes in this long middle period, happened in the history of Sharia as a legal system, were organic and did not change the general structure of things. That is, it did not change either its epistemological or ontological structure, but as importantly, it did not change its constitutional structures. The cogency and general operative logic of the system remained the same, which is to say that the political discursive tradition in Islam, at least in West Asia, had a consistent structure of its own and exhibited a systemic continuity throughout. Now, let me make a general claim, one that has to do with history in general and with Islamic political history in particular. My argument has been and continues to be that the history of Islam has largely not been written yet. The history of Islam that we got accustomed to so far is not indigenous and has almost exclusively been written from not just a European point of view, but from a distinctly colonialist point of view. So scholarship that you think is scholarship is really, much of it is a very sophisticated form of political venture called colonialism. That alone requires a series of 3 lectures just to elaborate on this point, and hopefully by the end of it, you will be quite convinced, in my opinion. There was no marked contribution from Muslims in deciding what their history is or was, or how it looks like. We have taken the standard European narrative as a second nature and treated it as if it is the only narrative that is possible. Specifically, this history suffers more rather than less distortions and bias, not to mention ideological construction when it is related to certain topics. For example, the issue of women, gender, and sexuality has been a hypersensitive theme in the construction of Islamic history at the hands of Europeans during the last number of decades. The other issue is the central sphere of politics and its related components, including questions, of course, as you all know, of democracy, freedom, and violence, or rather the presumed lack of freedom, the so-called Oriental despotism, and the violence that Europe attributed and continues to attribute to Islam as if it is a genetic feature. All this, of course, does not seem as ridiculous and hypocritical as it looks today, especially after the Gaza genocide, but it had acquired a heavy weight and played a significant role since the end of the 19th century, to say the least. Whether it was a deliberate distortion or not, there are at least two problems involved in the past construction of Islamic political history, especially its part or side, which I am interested in focusing on today. That is, the side that deals with what we may call constitutional history. The first problem is one of translatability. The problem of translatability is the problem of how to render, how to understand phenomena in another culture, another place, and another time when you do not have the same conceptual repertoire, the same terminology, the same words, the same experiences, not even the same facts and same entities that you happen to have and are accustomed to in your own time, culture, and place. Put very simply, how do I really understand, for example, the world of a peasant woman in the Sawad of southern Iraq in the 8th century AD? Even if I had extensive data on her life and how she lived on a daily basis, how do I know what she felt, how she articulated the world, her conception of herself as a human, as a mother, as a wife, as a daughter? What was her emotive makeup, and especially what she meant when she uttered language? Terms like, for example, land, mountain, life, justice, love. All these are terms that we think that everybody use them in the same way. Actually, even within this room, I will choose any one of you, and I will bet you once we are done discussing the meaning of, for example, justice or love, we will end up realizing that we mean by them two different things, and this isn't today. Imagine in another emotive world, another emotive culture, meaning emotive here, how is one constituted emotionally? Do we really have any clue as to what she could have exactly meant by any of these terms? The problem of translatability is not just a Wittgensteinian problem of philosophy, but also a deeply philological problem, a historical problem of first order. And so the fatal mistake that the Orientalists made was the failure of not attending to the problematic nature of their approach in terms of this challenge of translatability. But of course, mistakes have a function, a genealogy and a teleology. But of course, I will not go into these things. This alone, this kind of mistake is not really a mistake. It is a mistake, but not. Because mistakes, they are intelligible. They are not just freak of nature, and they have no substance for analysis, analytical substance. The fact remains that the Orientalists acted with such a sense of sovereignty that they did not even think that they may be doing something wrong. They just sovereignly decided what Muslims think and what their acts mean, without caring to check whether what they concluded could perhaps have missed the whole point altogether. The other problem that made the situation even worse is the Orientalist conception of a fragmented history of Muslim politics, where 12 centuries worth of political history is reduced to a series of sultanic reigns peppered with tyrannical events. This history was never seen as a process, like an organic body growing across time. It was never seen as a structure governed by underlying patterns and dynamics that operate institutionally and bound by general founding principles, a kind of Grundnorm, if you will. This structural perspective shifts the historian's emphasis from a chronological narration of events and specific facts, which sums up the entire Orientalist narrative, to a comprehensive systemic and institutional examination of the structures and institutional frameworks that influence and shape political and constitutional conduct. By exploring the structural elements that underpin such historical processes, we would be able to gain insights into the deeper forces at play and understand the interconnectedness of various events in ways that we otherwise would not be able to. Especially in writing his constitutional history, the study of structures is paramount. Constitutional history has often been confused with political history of events, a mainstream narrative that seems to dominate our minds, making for us the chief kind of history we know. In every discussion with scholars and in almost every class I teach, people interject my narrative of structure with the reminder that not all sultans and caliphs were just, some being outright tyrants. My answer and explanation ends up reminding them, in turn, of how we understand current constitutional systems, especially in liberal democracies. Just because Americans had the Andrew Johnsons, Nixons, and Trumps, وأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, it does not mean that we can say that the American political and constitutional system is a sham, that it is not democratic, that the USA is a tyranny. I mean, nobody can say really that's a first. I have been lecturing for no less than 45 years. This is. So the US has an enduring and functional constitution that, despite all disagreements about the critiques of it, is still generally considered democratic to one extent or another, from one angle or another. This modern constitutional system may not survive radical critique, or whatever you want to call it. Radical critique, imminent critique, but really the critique that I defined in the first lecture, not criticism. But this is not my point. Whether it survives or not, that's not really what my point is. My point is that you cannot judge the structure of the American constitutional system by the practices, or rather the malpractices and abuses of some of the country's corrupt presidents, judges, or even politicians. In the book I just mentioned, I argue, consistent with and in continuation of my argument in The Impossible State, that Islamic political governance had a structure characterized by a robust rule of law, in fact, more robust than anything we see in modern liberal democracies, and that the separation of powers was more delineated and more sharply drawn than we nowadays have in democratic systems. This did and might shock some people, but that's because they do not know enough really about the Islamic side. I would like, therefore, to address 3 points related to these claims. First, the robustness of the rule of law. Second, the quality of the law that rules. These are two different things. And third, the nature of the separation of powers in Islam. As for robustness of the rule of law, there is a serious difference between a law that is substantively and procedurally legislated by the people, or rather by men and women, and a law that is the result of interpreting statements that are ontologically autonomous. Here we ultimately speak of two very different sources of will: the will to rule or the will to law. The first source is anthropocentric, and since will resides in human beings can change them at will. In the Sharia, by contrast, there is a series of principles that are hierarchically organized that make legal interpretation, ijtihad, bound by these higher principles. The attention is always geared in the service of the community, as I explained before. The interests of the believers, quote unquote, being supreme. But these interests, just because they are supreme, do not have an autonomous will that decides for themselves what is and is not good for the community of Muslims. As I emphasized in the first lecture, the fact that a society or culture posits for itself a set of unchangeable higher principles makes it very different from a culture that claims total and unqualified autonomy in determining its own way of life. But this is not the only important characteristic of a robust rule of law. One of the most important tests for rule of law is obviously the extent to which the law rules. The spectrum of what I call legal impermanency ranges from the reasonably unchangeable to total suspension. In the Sharia, legal change was piecemeal and particularized, reinterpreting very specific cases as they needed more flexibility or new solutions to old problems. This is what I call reasonable unchangeability, because the stability of the law is not to be equated with rigidity or inability to adapt, but with a successful control over arbitrary change or change due to will to power, as we have it in the modern state, in the modern period altogether, in our age. It is the successful control over the crucial feature of suspending the law when a state declares a state of emergency. Radical or fast-moving change, characteristic of the modern state and modern society, is prevented by the notion of consensus, ijma', which itself guarantees the solidity and authorization of the madhab. The madhab, that is the legal school in Islam, for those who don't know, was not just a substantive legal phenomenon, that is substantive law, but also a constitutional one. That's why most people don't understand that the law in everywhere generally, but in Islam in particular, that's why it is more robust, itself, if it is formed or conceived of or practiced in a particular way, is itself part of the constitutionalization of the system. The madhab was one of the most powerful ways of curbing political decisionism that manipulated the law. The madhab gave the law a sanctity that has no parallel anywhere in modern systems of governance. This explains why the law in Islam always emerged victorious over all political forces. Even after bleak periods of political disarray or crises, as for instance happened in the last several decades under Mamluk rule, when the judiciary effectively collapsed, or when the early Ottomans instituted the Qanun upon their conquest of the new territories in the Balkans, Not that it is the same like the Mamluks, but it's kind of a unique event in Islamic constitutional history. That's when they conquered the Balkans, Greater Syria, Egypt, and the Hijaz. In these and all other cases, except of course in the case of the systemically destructive European colonization in the 19th century, in all these cases, the rule of the Sharia as the supreme law was eventually restored. And the Mamluk case is the most notorious because if the sources are read carefully, and this is part of the argument in my book, I have almost one chapter about this, is to show how in the last kind of 80, 90 years of Mamluk rule, things really collapsed badly. But then when the Ottomans come, it's as if nothing happened. It's like everything is back to business, as if this 80 years did not almost destroy the material life of Egypt. Second, the quality of the law that rules. Remember the three? So this is the second one. Second, the quality of the law that rules. And here, where we can see the importance of the points I tried to make in the first two lectures. People shout the rule of law at every turn, but the rule of law is not everything. Or rather, it is not a sufficient condition for justice. There can be a rule of law without justice being done. In fact, many dictatorships insist on the rule of law. Nazi Germany being a spectacular example. In order for justice to be achieved, the law must not only satisfy the condition of rule of law, but also of being itself substantively good, humane, compassionate, tolerant, and primarily attentive to the human subject as the final goal. That's the subject of the last lecture. And if I were to sum up the findings on my almost 5 decades of scholarship on this point, I can confidently say that the Sharia scored high on all of these accounts. In fact, higher than any modern system law I know. This was the gist of my second lecture, as I said. There is a massive difference between a law that rules for the final goal of creating a regulated ethical life and a law whose final aim is the imposition of order for the sake of increasing national or class power. And that's what we have today. The first attends to the individual and the community. The second, to politics and political power. Third, the nature of the separation of powers in Islam itself. On the surface, it looks as if the powers in both Islam and liberal modernity are the same in terms of division, legislative, judicial, and executive. There is the legislative power that is separate from the executive, and both of these fulfill functions separate from the judiciary. My argument, however, is that first, the separation of powers in the modern state is a challenge that continues to plague liberal democracies. Second, Islam, without an artificial attempt at creating a separation, managed to establish a system of separation because it did not have a unitary state. And because of particular deeply theological beliefs, by the way, which have a direct impact on constitutional organization. So theology, when somebody tells you theology, never think it's a bunch of abstract concepts that are not related to our learning, they fly in the air. Theology can be highly, and we call it political theology. But even in Islam, it is kind of, the connections are less obvious, but eventually, if you understand it correctly, it's quite politically potent. This last consideration, that the modern state is unitary, gives rise to the starkest fact about Islam, which is my third argument, namely that the legislative power in Islam was more authoritative than its modern counterpart by leaps and bounds. Before I begin addressing these points and explain what I mean by authoritative, because it can have many meanings, let me say, by way of introduction, a few things about our modern constitutional predicaments. One of the most fundamental problems in modern constitutionalism is the blurring of lines and overlaps between and among the three powers. This often results in conflicts between these powers and gives rise to challenges in interpreting and enforcing the separation. On the other hand, it is widely acknowledged that the strict separation may lead to rigidity and inefficiency, since cooperation between the powers is often needed, if not crucial, for addressing urgent matters. Excessive checks and balances can result in slow decision-making, creating difficulty for a government to respond promptly to crisis or enact necessary reforms, which are really the constant challenge of modern states. There are always crises and always reforms. There is always something to do for the modern state, if you notice. There is also the problem of an overactive judiciary. That's yet another problem, where the judicial branch concentrates too much power in its hands. A fundamental concern is the question of democratic legitimacy of such hyperactivism of the judiciary. In a liberal democracy, where presumably popular will is the supreme value and the cornerstone of governance, unelected judges strike down laws that have been enacted by elected representatives. But this is perceived by many influential voices as highly undemocratic. This effectively constitutes a major tension between an unelected judiciary and elected branches, not to mention the problem of imbalance between the branches. Finally, we cannot overlook what is, in my opinion, the most devastating critique of modern governmental practices and modes of governance, namely the so-called bloodless constitutional revolution. So what is this bloodless constitutional revolution? Bureaucracies are characterized by unelected officials as well as by insulated decision-making processes where they themselves legislate, adjudicate, and execute all at once without resorting to courts or to some organs that are elected. By the way, you face it today daily. You miss a toll, you don't pay. In 3 months, 4 months, you are away traveling. It is a real story, by the way. You come back after 3 months and you find the bill from $10 for the toll with penalties and interest. It became $150. So, well, this is not fair because it's only $10 and they are asking me to pay $150. I got on the phone, tried to do everything to call anybody. They just simply, they find a way not to address your concern, as we all know. And so I said, you know what, it's easier to pay. You get my point. And this is the smallest thing in life. Imagine the other things where we talked about them, where you are caught in bureaucratic nightmares. Franz Kafka all over again. So bureaucracies tend to operate independently of public opinion, raising questions about responsiveness to democratic mandates. They are led by professional experts who tend to prioritize technical efficiency and profit over democratic deliberation. Caring little about democratic processes, if we put all these problems together, and there are many more, but I don't have time to discuss them, and add to them the flagrant feature of interest groups, which we live today very colorfully, especially in the United States, I mean the lobbies or the public affairs committees, they call them, then we understand the problem of democracy in the presumably most democratic state in the world. Note that all these problems originate from a distinct European history. And all of them, except the last, that is the bureaucratic domination, are the result of reforms and changes that Europe had to implement in order to avoid the brutal life it lived under a merciless and cruel church and a feudal and monarchical violence of pathological dimensions. The separation of powers is a political doctrine that was strictly a European medication for a dangerous European disease. Reading Islamic constitutional history makes the reader look at this phenomenon as an anomaly, a painful medicine for a strange pathology. This is part of what I meant in my first lecture when I spoke about comparison and contrast as methods of inquiry. It is important to realize that Islam's constitutional division between the powers was not the result of a traumatic experience or a reaction to a violent and oppressive situation. Separation of powers, or what we have come to call separation of powers after Europe made the issue a universal one through colonization, was in its embryonic origins the result of a fairly basic but fundamental theological tenet, one having to do with God's absolute power of ownership, which bestows on him the full meaning and capacity of sovereignty. It was an absolutely logical inference to conclude from this robust doctrine that if God owns the world through the act of creation, then there is no administrator or manager of the world other than him. Any such right to decide in the world must thus be a derivative right, authorized by him in form and content. From this logical series, one must conclude that if man were to act in this capacity, that is, as God's delegate or deputy, then the ultimate authority of rule and decision is not man's. And so the punchline, no man shall rule man. But what does it mean? And by the way, there is a whole history of it in the Quran itself, but I don't want to go into it now. Why no man shall rule man? It has actually to do with the Trinity and the denial of Jesus as the Son of God, not as a prophet or messenger of God, but as the Son of God. But what does it mean that no man shall rule man? It means that no human being is entitled to decide for others what law governs them, by virtue of himself as either a source of law or even as a spokesman for an authority. Instead, the law that governs must be communal and deducible from binding higher principles, two absolutely necessary conditions for law's validity. These are always there in the Muslim tradition. If you have questions, I would love to have a question about this one to explain more. This is the summation of the madhab, a group of associated jurists who over time deduce law through a hermeneutical system on whose principles they aggregately agree, a field of semiotics that shines a methodological light on God's will and exemplarity. The collective doctrine of the madhab also meant that the law came from an aggregation of juristic voices representing the community's will. For it is important to note that a law that comes from above, from a higher authority, top down, is not the same as one that comes from the people for the people, as they say. The jurists of early Islam, who articulated the fiqh, the substantive law, came from the populace. They lived among common people as part of these people. And on average, they belonged to what we call today middle or middle lower classes. This is the first 2-3 centuries when the law was formed in substance. After that, it's too late for the law to become suddenly seriously bourgeois or Marxian, with Marxian kind of analysis. Although many people think that still, Marxist analysis with power analysis of Foucault are applicable to Islam. A great many of them were artisans, craftsmen, and shop owners, while some were small merchants or the like. These jurists were authorized as jurists because the basis of their competence was the very knowledge of the law, which is why the law is known as fiqh. Fiqh, understanding. That's what the word means. Fiqh is understanding. To know the law and know it in the most ethical way, that is through a non-separation of knowledge and ethics between law and ethics, constitutes the very authority of the juristic voices, which means that the law must always issue from an epistemic moral source, not a political one. I cannot emphasize for you the fundamental importance of this principle. The implications of this principle are staggering. This means that if a caliph or a sultan pronounces on a legal matter, then the basis of his pronouncement is not a political but rather legal, for it is in his own personal knowledge of ijtihad that makes what he says legitimate. That's why the Ottomans, in order to have this Ottoman sultans, in order to have any real legal power, they had to bring Shaykh al-Islam and put him in the capital. And Shaykh al-Islam could even depose and execute sultans, which he did. I mean, not one, a series of them. So kind of there was always a price for the law. You want a sultan to have a little bit of say in the law, it had to depend on the law in the figure of the Shaykh al-Islam. Look how the circle goes. They couldn't escape it. There was no way of escaping the Sharia. Why? Because it was the rule of law. It constituted the ultimate master, because it was a culture. It was a habitus. But this legislative competence was not located in a narrowly defined body, in the way our parliaments and congresses are defined nowadays. Because of their paradigmatic learning and ethical exemplarity, the jurists were the custodians of religion. As represented in the adage, the ulama are the heirs of the prophets. Al-ulama'u warathatul anbiya. One can then say that the so-called legislative has defined Islamic identity. The legislative, notice here in the three branches of power, the legislative is the most important one in the Muslim tradition. It defined the Islamic identity. What is and what is not Islamic. How to go about living in that particular way. It was, in other words, constitutive of what we might call Islamic culture, as I emphasized several times. I think this one, by now, everybody has gotten the lesson. This is why I insist that the Sharia is that it is a culture writ large. The cultural and madhabic basis of the law, therefore, guaranteed the total autonomy of the legislative, making it immune to political intrusions. The sultans may violate the law, but they could not ignore or replace it. They may violate the law, but the law stood as their judge and the ultimate benchmark of truth. In other words, the law stood above anything a king or an emperor did or said, decreed or commanded. The separation between the legislative and the executive, the most important part of the doctrine of separation, was therefore not only natural and organic, but also provided a robust model that transcends the modern meaning of separation exponentially. Suffice it to say that hundreds of sultans came and went, yet none of them even entertained the idea of suspending the Sharia, and much less substituted with a law of his own. Now, of course, the modern state, as you know, suspension of the law is part of what we call the martial state. Any state can, under pressure, resort to this without any... a sultan who said, oh, no, let's suspend the Sharia now. It's my law that applies. You cannot do anything in violation of this limited law. That never happened and was inconceivable. To this picture, we must add elements that are not structural but historical. So far, we spoke about the structure of the legal in Islam. But structures are affected by their environments. And the more drastic the force of the environment, the more the structure is affected and changed in some way. What I have in mind is the interesting fact that during the 3rd Hijri century, Muslim rulers started bringing in mercenary forces to constitute their armies. This process reaching its pinnacle in the Mamluk dynasty. The introduction of foreigners helped in fortifying the separation and therefore autonomy of the legislative. Because these soldiers did not have any cultural or religious claims beyond their executive function. Foreigners who came to rule, that's the business of rule, like dynasties, specialized in rule. And so they did their rule and they didn't bother with the rest of it. They meaning what rule is to provide security, internal and external, and a few other things for taxes. That's the bottom line. And of course, they also went warred and gathered booty. But the point is that because they are foreigner, it strengthened the concept of separation, and the executive became even more separate from the legislative. Which brings me finally to executive competence. Let me begin by nuancing the sultanic power to legislate. As I said, a sultan, a caliph, or for that matter anyone else, including simple farmers and blacksmiths, may exercise ijtihad if they have the necessary juristic training, meaning the ilm, the knowledge, the ijtihad. But if they do so, they would not be acting in their capacity as sultans, caliphs, farmers, or peasants, but rather as mujtahids of one level or another. Sultans and caliphs did have the right to exercise their own discretion, something that was also called ijtihad, within a restricted sphere of responsibility. I cannot emphasize enough to you that this sphere was always defined by the Sharia, and it is this sphere that was the most significant arena to debate constitutional boundaries. That's again kind of a significant part of the book. There are like 2-3 chapters just on this point that I just mentioned. The sphere that was defined by the Sharia, that is the realm of executive governance, consisted of general categories that remained unchanged ever since they were conditionally identified in Mawardi's seminal works, which he articulated as a schematic summary of Islamic juristic doctrine and practice. This is what I call administrative and military practice. What interests me here is the comparative thinness of this administrative or bureaucratic practice, if you allow the anachronism here a bit, compared to today's bureaucratic administrative intrusion, which is said to dominate over popular will, as I spoke before. The Islamic parallel is a drop in the bucket. But let's look at the sultanic duties and functions, namely the executive functions. The first is Hifdhuddin. That's according to one of the most influential exposés of the sultanic functions, and which were adopted by many jurists for centuries. And it is by Mawardi himself, the great Mawardi. The first is Hifdhuddin, that is preservation of religion. Significantly, this preservation must proceed according to the way religion has been established and sanctioned by the predecessors, the way the tradition has been established. Politically, this is intended to reassert the supremacy of the Sharia over the interpretive and legislative impulses of the ruler, a constitutional act of first order, and one that Mawardi, as well as every other political Muslim writer, insisted on. The implication here is that the ruler is not to initiate any divergent interpretation of the Sharia and must not let any other person or group engage in it either. Preservation of religion, Hifzuddin, presumes another requirement to the effect that the Sultan's function includes the diligent application of deen with a view to making it a praxis. Not just practice, but a praxis, something that you do regularly as a technique of the self. The second requirement relates to domestic and external security, including protection from heretical groups that are seditious and destructive. The fourth is levying taxes according to the dictates of the law, while maintaining proper conduct in the process of collecting and redistributing them. Of course, quite often this was violated, but then there was always a friction and kind of a sort of legal militancy to bring them down. The fifth is to administer Sharia and mazalim in a just and fair manner, while the sixth is carrying out the complementary ordinances of the weighty Quranic hudud. Finally, the Sultan must elect trustworthy and competent officials who will act as his deputies in running the affairs of the domains. This requirement implies that the duty of responsibility as well as the accountability in administering the polity. So he cannot just let things run loose. He has to be, this sounds like these 7 requirements sound like just general theoretical prescriptions. But interestingly, if you decipher the literature well, you realize that each one of them constitutes the exposition of books or fields of knowledge. And so, for example, the protection of the border, it translates into what? Into really the entire extent of the discourse on jihad, meaning international law, how you fight, the laws of warfare, etc., which seem to me now, it's interesting that seems to me that they are much more, were much more honorable than anything we see today. Notice that these, if you look at the 7 carefully, that none of these functions intrude on the legislative. They don't involve legislative functions. The executive executes. Finally, it is easy now to understand the constitutional place of the judiciary in Islam. Because of the nature of knowledge and ethics, the executive can never make law. It can only give administrative pronouncements on the 7 executive fields I just enumerated, which means that it cannot dictate to the judiciary the substance of the law that the latter applies in their courts. The only exception to this are the Ottomans, who kind of pushed the jurists in the hierarchy of the empire, not everywhere, but the judicial hierarchy of the empire, to apply certain rules within the madhab. That's the most radical interference in the Sharia. But that's still, it's not the Sultan's law. It is just simply the Sultan's preference for one of the opinions or options available within the madhab, within the Sharia. Only the legislative culture, as a sociology of knowledge, can supply the personnel to serve in the judiciary. The substantive loyalty of the judiciary was therefore to the legislative. The judiciary was only appointed and dismissed by the executive, and so insofar as the technicalities of appointments and dismissals were concerned, it was the executive that held sway. These were the fundamentals of the system, and because they were fundamentals, they endured until the beginning of the 19th century. With colonialism, everything changed. The legislative was destroyed, and the executive held almost total power. This is the key problem of modernity, by the way, is that this balance, this ecology I've been describing, this appeared in the 19th century because the executive took over the legislative. So the legislative collapsed totally. where people wonder what happened to the crisis in modern Islam and the crisis of this and this is fundamental to what happened to Muslims in the 19th century. The ecological balance developed in Islam since the Quran saw light in Mecca now underwent systematic and systemic destruction. But this is only half of the story, half of the destruction. The other half occurred when Muslims were converted to the colonialist Orientalist narrative, to this new doctrine, accepting to read their own history through the prism of colonial officers and colonial scholars who spoke about Islam and Muslims as human animals and effectively treated them as such. Do I need to say more, really?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to take questions.